Some of the wealthiest institutions in pre-modern Asia were built by men who owned nothing. The monks who founded them had taken vows of personal poverty. They had renounced property, family, accumulation, the entire apparatus of worldly wealth, as a condition of their spiritual practice. And from that foundation of individual renunciation, they built institutions that owned land across entire provinces, lent money to merchants and peasants at scale, stored and distributed grain across regions, and accumulated endowments that compounded over centuries without interruption. By the height of the Tang Dynasty in China, Buddhist monasteries controlled a significant fraction of the agricultural land in some of the most productive regions of the empire. Their economic footprint was not incidental to their religious function. It was structural, and it was vast. This is not a story about hypocrisy. It is a story about institutional design, about how specific structural features built into religious organizations created conditions for capital accumulation that secular institutions of the same era could not replicate. It is, at its core, a story about three things: legitimacy, tax treatment, and time. And once you see how those three forces interact, you will recognize the same pattern operating in the most powerful wealth-accumulating institutions of the modern world. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where we open the books that were never meant to be public. If you want to understand the real mechanics of money before the next crisis makes them impossible to ignore, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video we publish is another page of the ledger, the hidden one. To understand how Buddhist monasteries became economic engines, you have to begin with the theological architecture that made donations not merely generous, but structurally rational. The Buddhist doctrine of merit, dana in Sanskrit, held that giving to the Sangha, the monastic community, generated karmic credit for the donor. This was not a vague spiritual benefit. It was a precisely conceived transaction within a cosmological framework that most of the population of Tang China, Heian Japan, and medieval Southeast Asia took as seriously as any contract they would sign in a secular court. The monk who received your donation was, by virtue of his spiritual discipline and renunciation, a field of merit, a particularly fertile ground in which your gift would generate returns that would manifest across multiple lifetimes. The monastery was, in economic terms, a vehicle for converting present material wealth into future spiritual returns. What this doctrine created, at the level of the whole economy, was a continuous and largely voluntary transfer of private wealth into monastic hands. Merchants donated before trading voyages, seeking favorable karma for the journey. Rulers donated on the eve of military campaigns. Aristocratic families donated on behalf of deceased relatives, seeking to improve their position in the next life. Ordinary farmers donated harvests in years of surplus, building the kind of relationship with a local monastery that they hoped would translate into grain loans in years of scarcity. Each of these donations was, individually, an act of spiritual investment. Collectively, they constituted a river of capital flowing continuously in a single direction, from the productive economy into institutions that were structured by their own rules to never distribute it back out. Individual monks could own nothing. The monastery, as a corporate entity, could own everything. The tension between those two facts is the entire economic history of Buddhist institutional wealth. The second structural advantage was fiscal, and it transformed the monastery from a recipient of donations into a compounding machine. In Tang China, as in most pre-modern agrarian states, the primary tax burden was land tax, a levy on agricultural production that fell heavily on the peasant farmers who worked the fields. Monastic land was typically exempt from these obligations, either through formal imperial grants or through the practical difficulty of taxing institutions that the state had itself legitimized as centers of spiritual authority. This exemption was not a minor administrative detail. It was the mechanism through which ordinary land donations became extraordinary financial advantages over time. Consider the arithmetic. A secular landowner receiving grain from a tenant paid a portion of that income in tax, maintained the land from what remained, and consumed or traded the surplus. A monastery, receiving the same land as a donation, paid no tax on the income it generated. The entire surplus was available for reinvestment, in more land, in lending operations, in grain storage facilities, in the physical infrastructure of the monastery itself. Every generation, the gap between the monastery's effective return on its assets and the return available to secular landowners widened. The exemption was, in the language of modern finance, a structural alpha that compounded indefinitely. Rulers were not unaware of this dynamic. Tang emperors who patronized Buddhism did so not out of financial naivety, but out of a specific calculus of political legitimacy. The Buddhist concept of the Dharmaraja, the righteous ruler who supports the Sangha and thereby demonstrates that heaven has conferred its mandate upon him, made monastic patronage one of the most efficient forms of political legitimation available to an emperor whose claim to rule rested on the mandate of heaven. The monastery legitimized the state. The state exempted the monastery from taxation. Each institution underwrote the other's authority, and the economic consequences of that mutual legitimation accumulated silently over centuries. By the Tang Dynasty's peak in the 7th and 8th centuries, large Chinese monasteries had evolved into something that had no precise secular equivalent. Institutions that combined the functions of landlord, bank, grain warehouse, and social welfare provider within a single corporate structure governed by religious law. The monastery as landlord leased its landholdings to tenant farmers, collecting rents in grain that flowed into storage facilities capable of holding reserves across multiple harvest seasons. This gave the monastery a stabilizing function in the local agricultural economy. In years of poor harvest, it could release grain at below-market rates to tenant farmers who had nowhere else to turn, generating both loyalty and karmic credit among the local population. The monastery as lender extended credit to merchants undertaking trading expeditions and to farmers needing seed grain or tools between harvests. The interest charged on these loans, carefully calibrated to remain within the bounds of what was considered acceptable under Buddhist ethical guidelines, generated returns that were reinvested into further landholding or further lending capacity. What this created, at the level of the regional economy, was a form of financial intermediation, the channeling of surplus capital from holders who did not immediately need it toward productive uses, that the secular economy of the Tang period could not replicate at the same scale or with the same durability. Secular lenders faced inheritance division, political disruption, and the mortality of their principals. The monastery faced none of these constraints. It was structurally immortal. Its endowment could not be divided among heirs. Its assets could not be seized by a political rival who had overthrown its founder. Its investment horizon was, in principle, infinite, and the power of an infinite investment horizon, compounding over centuries without interruption, is the deepest source of the extraordinary wealth that some of these institutions eventually accumulated. The three pillars that explain Buddhist monastic wealth, legitimacy, tax treatment, and time, are not historical curiosities. They are the operating principles of the most powerful wealth-accumulating institutions in the modern world. The university endowment is the most direct structural parallel. Harvard University's endowment currently exceeds $50 billion. It has accumulated that sum over nearly 4 centuries through a combination of donations from graduates and benefactors who receive reputational and legacy benefits in return, the secular equivalent of karmic credit, and through tax-exempt investment returns that compound without the drag of capital gains taxes or dividend taxes that apply to equivalent secular portfolios. The university, like the Tang Monastery, is structured as a permanent institution with an infinite investment horizon governed by rules that prevent distribution of principal to individual stakeholders. The arithmetic of compounding over that horizon with tax exemption produces outcomes that no finite taxable institution can match. The Sovereign Wealth Fund operates on similar principles at the state level. Norway's government pension fund Global, funded by oil revenues and managed with a multi-generational investment mandate, has accumulated assets exceeding $1.7 trillion, the largest single fund in the world. Its governance structure prevents political short-termism from depleting the principal. Its investment horizon is explicitly designed to outlast any individual government or political cycle. It is, structurally, a secular monastery, an institution that converts a present windfall into a permanent endowment, governed by rules designed to protect its capital from the consumption impulses of the people nominally in charge of it. The investment arms of modern religious organizations complete the contemporary picture. The Vatican's financial holdings, the Church of England's investment portfolio, the endowments of major Islamic Waqf institutions in the Gulf, these are direct institutional descendants of the same structural logic that made Tang Dynasty monasteries the dominant economic actors in their regions. Legitimacy generates donations, tax treatment generates structural alpha. Time transforms both into compounding wealth that secular competitors cannot replicate. The Great Anti-Buddhist Persecution of 845 CE also has its modern echoes. Every political confrontation with tax-exempt institutional wealth, every legislative debate about university endowment taxation, every sovereign government that has looked at the landholdings of a major religious institution and decided that the fiscal cost of the exemption exceeds the political cost of removing it, is replaying the same confrontation that Wuzong's officials staged in the Tang countryside 12 centuries ago. The state and the exempt institution are always, eventually, in structural tension. The only variable is how long the accumulation phase runs before the reset arrives. The monks who built the great monasteries of Tang China were not accumulating wealth in spite of their vows of renunciation. They were accumulating it because of the institutional structure that those vows made possible. Individual poverty and collective wealth are not contradictions. They are, in specific structural conditions, complementary. The renunciation of personal ownership created a corporate entity with no heirs to divide its assets, no mortal principle whose death would trigger redistribution, and no consumption appetite to drain its surpluses. That entity, given legitimacy, tax exemption, and time, became one of the most powerful capital accumulation machines in pre-modern history. Long-term institutional wealth is not built on intelligence or ambition or even on the productive genius of any individual actor. It is built on three things: legitimacy, which generates continuous inflows, tax treatment, which prevents outflows, and time, which transforms the gap between the two into compounding wealth that eventually dwarfs anything that could have been accumulated in a single lifetime or a single generation. The institutions that understand this principle, whether they are monasteries in 8th century China or university endowments in 21st century America, are playing a different game from everyone else. Not a faster game, a longer one. And in finance, as in history, the longer game almost always wins. If this gave you a new perspective on how wealth actually accumulates, not through individual genius, but through institutional design, legitimacy, and time, subscribe to Hidden Ledger. History is the only map we have, and the patterns it reveals keep appearing in different forms in every era. The question is whether you are reading the map or walking the same path again without knowing it. Japan's monastic institutions developed a variation on this pattern that took the structural logic to its martial extreme. The Sohei, warrior monks attached to large monasteries around Nara and later Kyoto, represented the fusion of spiritual authority with the physical enforcement capacity necessary to protect institutional wealth in a period of political fragmentation. A monastery that controlled productive land in a region contested by rival warlords needed more than legitimacy and tax exemption to preserve its assets. It needed the capacity to defend them. The warrior monk was the institutional solution to that problem, an agent who could simultaneously invoke spiritual authority and exercise military force, serving the monastery's interest in asset preservation with a directness that no secular institution could deploy without undermining its own legitimacy. Tibet carried the structural logic furthest, developing a theocratic system in which spiritual and political authority were fused at the highest level of the state. The monastery was not merely an institution within the political order, it was the political order, and the wealth that flowed from that position was not incidental to religious function, but constitutive of it. The Dalai Lama system, which concentrated both spiritual succession and political authority in a single institution governed by recognized reincarnation, created a form of immortal sovereignty that had no parallel in either secular or religious governance elsewhere in the pre-modern world. The structural reset arrived in 845 CE, and it arrived with the speed and finality that characterizes every confrontation between a fiscally stressed state and an institution whose tax-exempt status has become a structural drain on public revenue. The Tang Emperor Xuanzong, known to history as Emperor Wuzong, issued what became known as the Huichang Suppression, the Great Anti-Buddhist Persecution. The numbers are extraordinary. Over 4,600 monasteries were destroyed or seized. More than 40,000 smaller temples and shrines were demolished. Somewhere between 260,000 and 300,000 monks and nuns were forced to return to lay life and were therefore returned to the tax registers as productive, taxable subjects. Monastic landholdings were confiscated and redistributed to private owners or directly to the state. The motivation was not primarily theological, though theological justifications were provided. It was fiscal. The Tang state in the 840s was under severe financial pressure. Military campaigns on multiple frontiers, a shrinking tax base, and the structural problem that decades of monastic accumulation had removed an ever larger fraction of the empire's most productive agricultural land from the tax rolls. The monasteries had become, from the state's perspective, a parallel fiscal system, one that extracted surplus from the agricultural economy through the mechanism of religious donation and returned almost none of it to the state in the form of tax revenue. The Huichang suppression was not a religious event with economic consequences. It was a fiscal intervention with religious justification. The pattern it represents, a period of institutional accumulation, followed by a state confrontation with the fiscal consequences of that accumulation, followed by a forced redistribution, is one of the most consistent sequences in the history of institutional wealth. It appears in Henry VIII's dissolution of the English monasteries in the 1530s, driven by precisely the same combination of fiscal urgency and political will to break a parallel power structure. It appears in the French Revolutionary confiscation of church property in 1789, which was used to back the assignats, the paper currency we discussed in an earlier video in this series. The mechanism changes across cultures and centuries. The structural logic is identical.